This photo is from 1863. This is the story of a couple who transformed charity into horror, who used kindness as a mask for the most unimaginable evil. A story that remained hidden for decades until the earth could no longer keep its secrets. On a cold October morning in 1863, Victoria Henderson and her husband Charles woke up like any respectable couple in Victorian society. She prepared morning tea while he read the local newspaper. Nothing distinguished them from their neighbors except for one peculiarity that everyone admired: their extraordinary generosity with orphaned children. The Hendersons were known throughout the region for their kindness. They regularly visited orphanages and poor houses, always willing to offer a temporary home for children in need. Neighbors constantly praised them. "What a blessed couple," the ladies said at church. "How many children they've saved from misery," local merchants commented. But there was something strange about the Hendersons' adoption patterns. Children would arrive, stay for a few weeks or months, and then simply disappear. When questioned, the couple always had a plausible explanation. "Little Rose went to a wonderful family in London," they would say. "Young Henry found work on a farm up north. Little Catherine went to live with a distant aunt." Neighbors accepted these explanations without question. After all, it was common in the Victorian era for children to be sent to work or live with distant relatives. Child mortality was high, sanitary conditions were poor, and many children simply disappeared from social statistics without leaving traces. What no one knew was that Victoria Henderson kept a meticulous diary written in her careful handwriting. This diary documented each arrival, each name, each age. But more disturbingly, it also documented each departure, not to loving families or distant jobs, but to shallow graves dug under moonlight in the extensive back garden. Charles Henderson worked as an accountant at a respectable firm in town. He was meticulous, organized, and applied the same accounting precision to the couple's nocturnal activities. Each burial was carefully planned and executed. Each location in the garden was discreetly marked with small stones which, to casual observers, looked like mere decorative elements of the landscape. England in 1863 was experiencing a period of great social transformation. The Industrial Revolution had created enormous population displacements, leaving thousands of children orphaned or abandoned. Social protection systems were primitive. Overcrowded orphanages were common, and many institutions accepted any help they could get. The Hendersons exploited this systemic vulnerability with calculated coldness. Victoria had developed a specific technique for selecting her victims. She looked for children who had little or no contact with the outside world, orphans without known relatives, street children without bonds, little ones who arrived at asylums already weakened by disease or malnutrition. She had a clinical eye for identifying those who wouldn't be sought after or whose absence wouldn't raise suspicions. The couple's method was disturbingly systematic. Children were received with genuine kindness in the first days. Victoria fed them well, provided hot baths, clean clothes. Charles played with them in the garden, taught simple games. For the little ones, who had known only deprivation and cruelty, those first weeks must have seemed like an unexpected paradise. But gradually attitudes changed. Food became scarce. Care diminished. Children were kept increasingly isolated, confined to the back rooms of the house. Neighbors occasionally heard nighttime crying. But when questioned, the Hendersons explained that the children were adapting or going through a difficult period. Victoria's diary reveals the mentality behind these acts. She saw children not as human beings, but as temporary projects. She wrote about them with the same emotional detachment someone would use to describe cultivating seasonal plants. "Little Grace is becoming problematic," she noted. "David has been too noisy lately. It's time to resolve the situation with Clara Ara." Charles, for his part, handled the practical aspects with professional efficiency. He had calculated exactly how many graves the garden could accommodate without raising suspicions. He had studied decomposition patterns and chosen locations where the soil was most suitable. He had even developed a rotation system, planting different seasonal flowers over each location to mask any odor or soil disturbance. The Henderson house sat on a property of approximately 2 acres, isolated enough for nighttime activities to go unnoticed. The garden was famous in the region for the beauty and variety of its flowers. Victoria was known as an exceptional gardener, and many local ladies came seeking advice about cultivating roses and ornamental plants. Ironically, flowers grew extraordinarily luxuriantly in that garden. The roses were larger and more fragrant than those anywhere else in the region. The daffodils bloomed with more vivid colors. Neighbors attributed this to Victoria's natural talent, never imagining what type of fertilizer enriched that soil. For almost 2 years between 1861 and 1863, the Hendersons operated their macabre scheme without arousing significant suspicions. The exact number of victims remains uncertain, but later evidence suggests there may have been at least 15 children, possibly more. Each represented a life interrupted, dreams never realized, a future stolen by human greed and cruelty. Victorian society, with all its rigid morality and apparent respectability, created the perfect environment for monsters like the Hendersons to operate with impunity. Reverence for authority, reluctance to question respectable neighbors, and the social invisibility of poor children provided the necessary cover for their crimes. But even the most careful criminals make mistakes. In the Hendersons' case, it was Victoria herself who planted the seeds of her own discovery. In her zeal for documentation, she had maintained not only the diary, but also small belongings from each child, locks of hair, small toys, pieces of clothing. She kept these trophies in a special box in the attic, as if they were precious memories of past vacations. Charles had repeatedly warned about the risks of this collection, but Victoria insisted. For her, these objects were proof of her efficiency, souvenirs of successfully completed projects. She couldn't bring herself to dispose of them, even knowing they represented incriminating evidence. The end came unexpectedly in the autumn of 1863. A routine inspection by local government, part of a new program to monitor rural living conditions, included the Henderson property. The inspector, a young and conscientious man named William Hartley, arrived without warning on a November morning. Hartley had been instructed to check sanitary and safety conditions, but something about the house's atmosphere bothered him from the moment he arrived. Victoria seemed too nervous for someone who supposedly had nothing to hide. Charles was visibly agitated, trying to rush the inspection and direct the official away from certain areas of the property. What really aroused Hartley's suspicions was the garden. Even in late autumn, with most plants dormant, there was something strange about the growth patterns. Certain areas of soil seemed richer, darker. There were subtle depressions in places where apparently nothing should be planted, and there was an odor, faint but distinctive, that he couldn't identify, but that disturbed him deeply. Hartley had served briefly in the Crimean War a few years earlier, and had learned to recognize certain atmospheres. That garden reminded him of old battlefields, places where many had died and been buried quickly. It was an association he tried to dismiss, but which persisted in his mind. Using his official authority, Hartley requested permission to examine the entire property more thoroughly. The Hendersons couldn't refuse without arousing even more suspicion. While Victoria accompanied him through the garden, offering nervous explanations about her gardening techniques, Hartley noticed the small stones that marked regular intervals across the terrain. It was then that he found something that changed everything. Partially exposed by recent rain, a small skeletal hand emerged from the soil near the rose bushes. Victoria tried to explain it was a dead animal they had buried, but Hartley was already summoning assistance from local authorities. The excavation that followed revealed a horror that shocked all of Victorian England. One by one, the graves were discovered. Small skeletons, some still with fragments of children's clothing, were carefully exhumed. The garden that had been admired for its beauty proved to be a clandestine cemetery. Charles tried to flee when he realized the situation was lost, but was captured a few miles from the property. Victoria, confronted with incontestable evidence, suffered a complete collapse. She alternated between denying everything and confessing disturbing details, often in the same conversation. The Henderson trial became a national sensation. Newspapers of the time covered every detail of the case, often with the sensationalism typical of Victorian press. The public was simultaneously horrified and fascinated. How could an apparently respectable couple have committed such systematic atrocities against innocent children? During the trial, even more disturbing details emerged about the couple's mentality. Victoria revealed that she saw her actions as a form of social cleansing, removing children she considered unnecessary from society. Charles described the murders in purely logistical terms, as if discussing a complex accounting problem. The defense tried to argue insanity, but evidence of methodical planning and careful execution made this strategy unsustainable. Victoria's diary in particular demonstrated clear awareness of the consequences of her actions and deliberate effort to avoid detection. Charles Henderson was sentenced to death and executed in December 1863. Victoria received life imprisonment. a sentence considered merciful at the time, possibly due to gender prejudices that assumed she had been influenced by her husband. She died in prison 15 years later, never expressing genuine remorse for her actions. The Henderson case exposed fundamental flaws in the Victorian child protection system. The ease with which the couple could obtain access to vulnerable children, the lack of supervision or follow-up, and the social invisibility of orphans created perfect conditions for predators to operate with impunity. The revelations led to significant reforms in adoption procedures and childcare. New regulations required more rigorous verification of adoptive families, periodic inspections, and detailed documentation of the whereabouts of children under institutional care. While these changes came too late for the Henderson victims, they helped prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Henderson property was eventually sold and demolished. A new house was built on the site, but never managed to completely rid itself of its sinister reputation. Subsequent residents reported oppressive atmospheres, inexplicable noises, and a persistent sense of sadness that seemed to permeate the ground. The garden, where so many children were buried, was completely removed and replanted. But some local residents claim that certain areas of the terrain never flourish properly again. Flowers wilt prematurely in specific locations, and lawns develop strange patches that resist all treatment efforts. Decades later, the Henderson case continues to fascinate crime scholars and social historians. It represents an extreme example of how the moral rigidity of Victorian surface could hide unimaginable depravities. It also illustrates the particular vulnerability of children in societies that view them as property or burdens, rather than individuals with their own rights. The names of the Henderson victims were largely lost to history. Official documentation of the time was inconsistent, and many of the children had arrived at orphanages without adequate identity records. This bureaucratic invisibility facilitated their disappearances and complicated later efforts to identify them properly. Modern researchers have attempted to reconstruct the victims' identities through fragmentary orphanage records, police reports, and trial testimony. So far, they have been able to identify with certainty only 7 of the children. Rose Collins, 8 years old, Henry Wright, 6 years old, Catherine Murphy, 9 years old, Samuel Patterson, 7 years old, Alice Johnson, 5 years old, William O'Brien, 8 years old, and Grace Wilson, 6 years old. Each name represents a complete life that was cruelly interrupted. Rose, who dreamed of learning to read. Henry, who made friends easily, even in the most difficult circumstances. Catherine, who sang to comfort younger children in the orphanage. Their individual stories were preserved in fragments in institutional records, moving reminders of lost humanity. Victoria Henderson's diary, preserved as judicial evidence, offers a disturbing window into the mind of a serial killer. Her entries reveal a gradual progression from morbid curiosity to calculated violence. Initially, she seemed genuinely interested in helping children, but gradually developed an obsession with total control over their lives and deaths. "Today I received little Rose," she wrote in a typical entry. "She is thin but has lively eyes. It will be interesting to see how long she remains so." The clinical and detached language of these entries shocks even modern readers accustomed to media violence. Charles Henderson, on the other hand, left few personal records. His work colleagues described him as meticulous but emotionally distant. Apparently, he viewed the murders as logistical problems to be solved efficiently. His contribution to the couple's activities was mainly technical planning, execution, and cover-up. The dynamic between Victoria and Charles remains a psychological mystery. It's unclear which of them initiated the murders or how they convinced each other to participate. Modern criminological theories suggest they may have fed off each other's violent fantasies, creating a spiral of escalation that culminated in serial homicide. The impact of the Henderson case extended far beyond their direct victims. Families in the region developed paranoid fears about leaving children alone or allowing strangers to approach them. Trust in the benevolence of respectable neighbors was severely shaken. Many parents began questioning people they would previously have considered above suspicion. This erosion of social trust had lasting consequences. Communities that previously functioned based on informal networks of mutual support became more cautious and insular. The Henderson case contributed to a broader cultural shift toward skepticism and suspicion that would characterize later decades. Today, more than 160 years later, the Henderson case remains relevant as a dark reminder of human capacity for evil. In an era of social media and digital surveillance, it might seem impossible for such systematic crimes to go unnoticed. But vulnerable children still disappear, Predators still exploit inadequate protection systems, and superficial respectability can still mask malevolent intentions. The lessons of the Henderson case about the need for constant vigilance, rigorous verification, and protection of vulnerable populations remain as important today as they were in Victorian England. The only difference is that we now have better tools to detect and prevent such atrocities if we have the will to use them properly. The Henderson story serves as a reminder that evil rarely announces its presence with dramatic fanfare. More frequently, it disguises itself as virtue, operating in the shadows of respectability and taking advantage of others' trust. The neighbors who praised the couple's kindness never suspected they were being deceived by consumer sociopaths. This case also illustrates how societies consistently failed to protect their most vulnerable members. The children who died in the Henderson garden were invisible not only to their killers, but to an entire social system that saw them as disposable. Their tragedy is also a reflection of their era's priorities and values. As we walk modern streets, passing apparently innocent suburban houses, it's worth remembering the fundamental lesson of the Henderson case. We never completely know what happens behind closed doors. Normality can be a mask, kindness can be a performance, and the most beautiful gardens can hide the darkest secrets. The Henderson victims deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as unique individuals whose lives were tragically interrupted. Their deaths serve to expose systemic failures and catalyze important reforms. In their memory, we must remain vigilant against those who would exploit the vulnerable and committed to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The ground where the Henderson house stood today houses a small public park. A discreet plaque mentions that the site has local historical significance without elaborating on the specific nature of that significance. Children play where other children were buried, a circle of life that offers a melancholic form of redemption. But on quiet nights, when the wind blows through the trees planted where rose bushes once grew, some local residents claim to hear distant echoes, laughter from children who never had the chance to grow up, voices that were silenced before they could tell their own stories. This is the story of the Hendersons, a couple who transformed charity into cruelty, who used kindness as a weapon, and whose crimes shocked an entire nation. It's a reminder that evil can wear any mask, and that our vigilance in protecting the vulnerable must be constant and relentless. If this story has touched you, if it has made you reflect on the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves, consider subscribing to our channel. We continue exploring the darkest mysteries of human history, always seeking the truth behind the masks that society uses to hide its most disturbing secrets. Because only by understanding our darkest past can we hope to build a safer future for all. Please like, share, subscribe for more videos.